Rebecca is one of the most remarkable women in the Bible, remembered for her courage, faith, and the way God guided her life. To understand her story, we need to go back in time and learn about her origins. She was the daughter of Bethuel, net of Nahor, who in turn was the brother of Abraham. This means that Rebecca was part of the same family from which God's promise to Abraham would come, to form a great nation. Rebecca grew up in Padan Aram, a region of Mesopotamia where families lived in large tents, tending flocks and making a living from agriculture. She was described as a young woman of great beauty, but her beauty wasn't just her appearance. Rebecca also stood out for her kindness, her willingness to help others, and her simple and pure way of life. Before we continue, please make sure you've liked and subscribed to the channel. By doing so, you're helping incredible Bible stories like Rebecca's reach many more people, and you're also a big supporter of my work. So, have you liked and subscribed? Now, let's dive together into Rebecca's beautiful biblical story, full of faith, purpose, and special revelations. The Bible shows us that Rebecca had common habits for the time. She would go out at dusk with her clay pitcher to fetch water from the town well. This was no easy task, as carrying water required strength, but Rebecca did it naturally, demonstrating responsibility and dedication. This young woman, who seemed to live a simple life, didn't yet know she was about to become part of God's grand plan. Rebecca had no idea that her story would be intertwined with the promise made to Abraham, and that from her would come descendants who would change the course of history for all humanity. She was just a young girl, going about her daily routine, but God was already preparing the details to transform her life forever. The story of Rebecca cannot be told without first looking at Abraham, God's chosen patriarch. Abraham was already old and had received God's promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that from this line would come a blessing to all nations. However, there was one important detail. His son Isaac, the heir of the promise, still didn't have a wife. And for Abraham, this couldn't be a matter of course. He knew that Isaac's marriage wasn't just a family matter, but part of God's plan. In those days, marriages were handled with great care because the choice of a wife could determine the future of all one's offspring. Abraham did not want Isaac to marry Canaanite women because the people of Canaan had strange customs and gods that could lead Isaac astray from the Lord's path. Therefore, Abraham called his trusted servant, many believe it was Eliezer of Damascus, a faithful and loyal man who had served him for many years, and gave him a mission of extreme importance to travel to his relatives in the land of Padan Aram and bring a wife for Isaac from there. The scene is moving. Abraham asks his servant to place his hand under his thigh, a gesture that, in the culture of the time, symbolized a sacred and solemn oath. It was as if Abraham was saying, "This promise is so serious that it is linked to the covenant I have with God." In a firm voice, Abraham declared, "Do not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live. You shall go to my relatives, and from there you shall take a wife for Isaac." The servant, concerned about the responsibility, asked a sensible question. "What if the woman doesn't want to come with me to this land? Should I then take Isaac back to his homeland?" But Abraham was categorical. "Be careful not to bring my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house, will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come, you will be free from this oath." These words demonstrated Abraham's unshakable faith. He believed that God himself would guide the entire process, for the promise did not depend on human circumstances, but on the Lord himself. So the servant swore to Abraham and prepared for the long journey. He took with him 10 camels laden with precious gifts, signs of honor and respect, to offer to the family of the young woman who would be chosen. We can imagine that procession departing, camels, servants, baggage, and a heart full of expectation. The servant had an immense responsibility. He was choosing not just a wife, but the future matriarch of a nation yet to be born. After many days of traveling, crossing hot deserts and arid paths, Abraham's servant finally reached the city of Nahor, the land of his master's relatives. It was late afternoon, the sun was already beginning to set on the horizon, and the sky was painted in shades of gold and red. The camels, tired from the long journey, needed to rest and drink water, so the servant led the group to the town's well, a strategic location where all the residents went to get water for their homes. Back then, the well was one of the busiest places in the village. Women would come out at dusk to fill their water jugs as the heat of the day had subsided. For the servant, this was the perfect time to watch and wait. But there was still a great challenge before him: how to choose the right wife for Isaac. Among so many young women who would come to the well, how could he be sure that he would find the woman chosen by God? It was at that moment that the servant did something very important: prayed. There, standing before the well, amidst the silence of the evening and the noise of the camels settling down, he lifted his heart to the Lord and asked for guidance. His words were full of faith and humility. "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, grant me good fortune today and show kindness to my master. See, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of this city are coming out to draw water. Now let the young woman to whom I say, 'Please let down your pitcher that I may drink,' and she says, 'Drink, and I will give your camels water also,' be the one you have appointed for your servant Isaac." Notice how wise and specific this prayer was. The servant didn't just ask for beauty or wealth. He asked for a sign of character. The chosen young woman had to be kind, generous, and willing to serve, even without being obliged. Giving water to a traveler was already a gesture of hospitality, but offering water to tend thirsty camels required effort, patience, and a willing heart. It was as if the servant was saying, "Lord, show me the one who carries within her the heart that you desire for Isaac's wife." While the servant was still praying, before he even finished his words, God was already answering. This shows the Lord's care in every detail, for while he sought guidance, Rebecca, he was already approaching, a jug on his shoulder, without imagining that his life would change forever at that moment. The servant little knew that his prayer was about to be answered. In a way so clear that it would leave no doubt, God was guiding every step of that mission. Abraham's servant still stood by the well, silently observing the activity. The sun was slowly setting, and the place was beginning to welcome the city's first young women, each carrying a clay or bronze pitcher on their shoulders. It was a common sight for those who lived in Paddan Aram. Women gathering, talking, laughing, and, at the same time, fulfilling the difficult task of fetching water for their homes. And it was at that moment that she appeared. Rebecca. The Bible describes her as a young woman of great beauty, a virgin, pure, who had never known a man. But more than her outward beauty, there was a simplicity and serenity in her demeanor that drew attention. Rebecca descended to the well with her pitcher over her shoulder. Her firm, elegant movements showed that this wasn't the first time she'd performed this task. She was accustomed to the routine, to the strength required to fill her pitcher and return home. Abraham's servant saw her from afar, and perhaps his heart ached with anticipation. He had just prayed for a sign, and now he watched intently as the young woman approached the spring. When Rebecca filled the jar and was about to go upstairs, the servant took courage and approached. He humbly said, "Please give me a little water from your pitcher to drink." It was a simple request, but loaded with meaning, for it was exactly the situation he had placed before God in his prayer, and that's when the answer began to take shape. Rebecca, without hesitation, responded kindly, "Drink, my lord." She quickly lowered the jug into her hands and gave him a drink. But she didn't stop there. With alert eyes and a willing heart, she looked at the camels standing around, tired from the long journey, and added, "I will also draw water for your camels until they are all satisfied." Here was the sign. There was, no doubt, Rebecca not only offered the bare minimum, but went above and beyond. Her attitude revealed hospitality, generosity, and a spirit of service. Now, we need to imagine what this meant in practice. A camel, after a long journey, could drink 100 to 150 liters of water. And Abraham's servant hadn't camels. This meant that Rebecca would have to go back and forth to the well several times, filling her pitcher over and over again, until all the animals were satisfied. This wasn't a quick job, much less an easy one, but Rebecca did it without complaining, with dedication and goodwill. Each step, each jar lifted, was a visible confirmation of the prayer the servant had prayed minutes before. As she worked, Abraham's servant watched her in silent wonder. The Bible says he sat in silence, wondering whether the Lord had made his journey prosperous. And the more Rebecca worked, the clearer it became that God's hand was guiding their encounter. The setting was perfect: a golden sunset, a tuned, generous young woman, and a prayer answered in real time. In that moment, there was no doubt Rebecca was God's chosen one to be Isaac's wife. After giving water to Abraham's servant and the 10 camels, Rebecca demonstrated a spirit of kindness and dedication that impressed everyone who observed her. It wasn't just a matter of fulfilling a polite gesture, but rather revealing a heart willing to serve, even without knowing the traveler or realizing the importance of his mission. Abraham's servant was silent for a moment, admiring every action of that young woman. He had already understood in his heart that God was confirming his prayer. So, as a form of gratitude and recognition, he took from the treasure he carried a gold ring to her nose and 2 gold bracelets into his hands and gave them to Rebecca. Surprised but without vanity, she received the gifts. It was common in the culture of the time to give gifts as a sign of honor and respect. But these gifts were not mere ornaments. They were symbols that God was preparing something great for her life. The servant then asked the decisive question, "Whose daughter are you? And is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" Rebecca responded with simplicity and respect, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." Here was the final confirmation. Bethuel was the grandson of Nahor, Abraham's brother. This meant that Rebecca was indeed Abraham's relative, as he had requested. The mission was being fulfilled exactly as God had promised. And once again, Rebecca showed her hospitality and generosity. We have plenty of straw and pasture for the camels at home, and also a place to spend the night. She not only offered shelter, but also provided food for the animals and provisions for travelers. At that time, offering hospitality was a sacred value in the East, but Rebecca's readiness went beyond the ordinary. It was as if her every word and action were guided by the hand of God. Upon hearing this, Abraham's servant could not contain his gratitude. He bowed down, prostrated himself on the ground, and worshipped the Lord right there before the well, acknowledging that Abraham's God had guided every detail of that journey. He exclaimed in prayer, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not withdrawn his kindness and faithfulness from him. As for me, the Lord led me on the way to the house of my master's brothers." Meanwhile, Rebecca, with the joy of a young woman full of life, ran home to tell her family everything that had happened. Little did she know that her willingness to serve a stranger was opening the door to a divine calling that would forever change her story and that of the entire people of Israel. In that simple act of hospitality, God's plan was unfolding. A young woman who had gone out only to fetch water returned home, bearing not only gifts, but also the promise of a future written by the Lord's hand. After the demonstration of hospitality by Rebecca, Abraham's servant Eliezer, he knew he was facing the fulfillment of a divine promise. He was thrilled, but he knew there was still one essential step to take: formalizing the choice and making it clear to his family that Rebecca was the woman destined for Isaac. He approached reverently and explained everything carefully: how Abraham had sent him, the prayer he had prayed at the well, and most importantly, how God had clearly answered by showing Rebecca as the chosen one. So Eliezer handed over the young woman and her family gifts of great value, carefully chosen. The Bible mentions gold jewelry and precious ornaments, signs of honor, respect, and recognition. These gifts were not just material goods. They were symbols of the importance of the mission he represented, and the promise God was fulfilling at that moment. Rebecca and her family were amazed by the richness and delicacy of those present. It wasn't just about wealth or luxury, but about a gesture loaded with spiritual meaning. Each jewel represented the hand of God, guiding that encounter, showing that Rebecca had been chosen for a divine purpose. Eliezer explained to his family that the choice was not his nor Rebecca's, but the Lord's himself. The Lord, who has guided my steps since the house of my master Abraham, has indicated that this young woman is the one he has chosen for his son Isaac. It is from her that he expects the continuation of the promise God made to our master Abraham. The family realized they were dealing with something greater than mere coincidence. They saw that God's hand was behind the entire situation, from the prayer at the well to Rebecca's kindness and even Eliezer's arrival. Rebecca, though young, understood the weight of the moment. She was not only overwhelmed by the gifts, but also by the responsibility that lay ahead. Isaac's future, the fulfillment of God's promise, and the continuation of Abraham's lineage depended on her faith and courage. And so, with the gift she had received and the confirmation that God had chosen her, Rebecca prepared to take a step that would completely change her life, leaving her family, her home, and her homeland to join the man chosen by God, the son of the promise. At that moment, every detail, every gesture, every look showed that Rebecca's story was being guided by a greater hand, and that she would become an example of faith, courage, and obedience that would echo through generations. After a day filled with extraordinary events at the well, Rebecca led Abraham's servant to her home. We can imagine the scene. The young woman crossing the dirt road, the sun already setting, the camels following behind, and anxiety mixed with anticipation hanging in the air. Upon arrival, the servant was greeted with curiosity and respect by Rebecca's family. He introduced himself solemnly, explaining who he was, where he came from, and above all, his mission, to bring a future wife to Isaac, Abraham's son, in accordance with God's will. Eliezer recounted the entire journey in detail, how Abraham had sent him, his prayer at the well, and especially the sign that confirmed Rebecca was the chosen one. He accurately described the moment when Rebecca offered water to him and the camels, demonstrating her kindness, hospitality, and generosity. Rebecca's family listened in silence, amazed. The Bible highlights that they realized that God was behind every detail of that story. He was not just a man from a distant land seeking marriage. He was someone guided by the Lord himself, fulfilling a greater purpose. The servant then made the most important request, that I may take Rebecca to be Isaac's wife. At that moment, the family gathered to deliberate. It's interesting to note how the parents and brother reacted. They saw that this was no ordinary or casual decision, but something that reflected divine providence. Without hesitation, they recognized the importance of the call and gave their blessing. The young lady is willing. Let her go in peace, and may God guide this path that he himself began. Rebecca, in turn, demonstrated courage and faith. She understood the magnitude of the mission, and even knowing she would leave her family, her home, and everything she knew, she accepted God's will. At that moment, she became not only an obedient daughter, but a woman who fully trusted the Lord to guide her every step of the way. The scene concludes with Abraham's servant, moved, offering additional gifts to the family as a sign of respect and gratitude. The gifts symbolized not only the honor of receiving Rebecca, but also the certainty that God had already determined everything. At that moment, the decision was made. Rebecca was ready to embark on a journey that would forever change her life and the history of the entire nation of Israel. Her faith, trust in God's guidance, and the hospitality she demonstrated would become indelible marks on her life. Rebecca knew this was a defining moment in her life. Until then, her routine had been simple: waking up, helping with household chores, caring for her family and animals, going to the well for water. But now, before her was a proposal that would change everything: to set off for an unknown land, marry a man she had never seen, and become the wife of God's promised son. Despite the weight of the decision, the Bible shows us that Rebecca did not hesitate. Her courage was not the result of recklessness, but of faith and trust in divine providence. She understood that God, who had guided every step of Abraham's servant, would also guide hers. We can imagine what was going through her heart: longing for her family, anxiety about the unknown, but also the certainty that she was about to fulfill a greater purpose. She accepted with humility and determination, saying she was ready to move on. Rebecca's decision wasn't just about getting married. It was an act of obedience, faith, and courage. She trusted that God would guide every step of the way and that their union would be blessed. Then, with her family's blessing, Rebecca said goodbye to home. It's moving to imagine the moment. Tears and smiles mingled, tight hugs, words of encouragement, and the promise that she would take her family's faith with her. As she walked, accompanied by her handmaidens and guided by Abraham's servant, each step was a reminder that God was present. She was about to become the wife of Isaac, the heir of promise, and the mother of a lineage that would transform the world. Rebecca's courage in that moment is an example for us all. Even when faced with the unknown, when we trust in God and follow His guidance, we can face any challenge. She didn't just accept an invitation, she accepted God's plan, becoming a woman of faith who marked the history of humanity. Before setting off on the long journey to the land of Canaan, Rebecca received something very special from her family: a blessing. At that time, giving a blessing meant much more than mere words. It was conveying protection, prosperity, and divine favor for the future. We can imagine the scene. Rebecca embraced by her parents, brothers, and servants, each look filled with love and concern. They knew she was about to face unknown challenges, but they also recognized that she was following God's will. Bethuel, his father, with a firm and emotional voice, spoke words of encouragement. "Daughter, may the Lord accompany you every step of this journey. May He guide your path, give you courage, wisdom, and joy in your new life. May your descendants be numerous and blessed, just as the promise made to Abraham." His mother, Milcah, added words of tenderness and care. "Dear daughter, always remember to trust in the Lord. Wherever you go, He will be your protection and your strength. May your life be filled with peace, love, and blessings." The Bible shows us that these words were not just formalities, but expressions of profound faith. For Rebecca's family, her mission to marry Isaac was linked to the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, and the blessing they bestowed had the power to invoke God's presence in the young woman's life. Beyond words, there were also symbolic gestures: a touch on Rebecca's hands, the anointing with oils or perfumes, the tight embrace that conveyed trust and security. Every detail showed that, even from a distance, the protection and love of her family would accompany her. Rebecca, with a heavy heart, received this blessing with humility and faith. She knew she wasn't just leaving her home, she was entering a divine plan, and every word her family spoke strengthened her courage. As Abraham's servant watched, he knew the way was open and blessed. Rebecca was prepared, her heart and mind aligned with God's will, ready for the new life that awaited her in Canaan. At that moment, the future lay before her like a long and unknown road, but illuminated by faith, the love of her family, and the certainty that God would guide her every step of the way. With her family's blessing and a heart full of faith, Rebecca set out from her homeland for Canaan. We can imagine the scene. The sun still rising on the horizon, dust rising from the dirt roads, and the camels carrying Eliezer's gifts, symbolizing the divine importance of that mission. The young woman wasn't traveling alone. She was accompanied by her servants, trusted women who would help her during the long journey. Each step was a mixture of anticipation, excitement, and a touch of fear. After all, Rebecca was leaving everything she knew: family, friends, her home, and the land where she grew up. The journey was not easy. They crossed arid plains, dry rivers, and unknown regions, facing the heat of the day and the cold of the night. The journey took days, and each stop required careful management of the camels, water, and supplies. Even so, Rebecca remained steadfast, trusting that God guided each step, and that the road, however difficult, was under His control. We can imagine Rebecca looking to the horizon every morning with hope, thanking God in her heart for every safe moment of the journey. She didn't just see obstacles. She saw an opportunity to live the divine plan unfolding before her. During the journey, Abraham's servant watched Rebecca closely. She demonstrated courage, kindness, and patience, essential qualities for the future wife of the heir of promise. Every gesture, every attentive glance at the camels and servant girls showed that she was ready to take on the role God had prepared for her. And even with all the difficulty of the road, there were also moments of beauty and reflection. The sun setting in shades of gold and red, the light wind blowing across the desert, and the silence of the night broken only by the distant sound of camels and the group moving steadily forward. All of this reinforced in Rebecca the certainty that she was being guided by a force greater than herself. Finally, after days of walking, they began to approach the land of Abraham. Rebecca could feel her heart racing. Each step brought her closer to the man who would be her husband, the son of promise, and the fulfillment of a plan she didn't yet fully understand, but knew was divine. The journey was not just physical, but spiritual. It was the beginning of a new life, marked by faith, courage, and obedience. Rebecca walked with determination, ready to become a protagonist in God's story, the future wife of Isaac, and the mother of descendants who would change the course of humanity. After days of traveling, Rebecca finally sighted the land of Canaan. Her heart was racing, a mixture of anxiety, anticipation, and faith. She knew she was about to meet Isaac, the son of promise, the man who would be her husband, and with whom she would share the divine plan God had laid out. As she approached, Rebecca saw Isaac in the field, busy praying or contemplating the landscape. He was alone, perhaps reflecting on his life, the loss of his mother Sarah, and God's care for him since birth. Isaac, for his part, had not yet met the young woman God had prepared to be his wife, but his life was about to be transformed. Abraham's servant, who accompanied Rebecca, saw the right moment. He said to the young woman, "This is the hour. Approach with humility and reverence." Following his advice, Rebecca covered her face with her veil, a traditional gesture of respect and modesty, and approached with careful steps. Each step was filled with emotion. She knew that her decision to leave her homeland was now being fulfilled in front of her future husband. When Isaac saw her approaching, their eyes met. We can imagine the silence that fell over the field for a few moments, as if time itself had stopped to mark that encounter. There was something special about that moment. It wasn't just the meeting of two young people, but the fulfillment of a promise made by God many generations ago. Rebecca, her heart filled with faith, bowed slightly and tilted her veil, showing respect and humility. Isaac, surprised and moved, immediately felt the divine connection in that encounter. He received her with kindness, and in that silent gesture, God's promise was made manifest. The divine plan was being fulfilled. The Bible shows us that this first encounter was not just physical, but spiritual. It was the beginning of a life together guided by the Lord, marked by faith, trust, and love. Rebecca had left her homeland trusting in God, and now she was reaping the fruits of her courage and obedience. As they walked back to the house together, each step symbolized Rebecca's transition to a new life. She left the past behind, but carried with her divine protection, the blessing of her family, and the certainty that she was exactly where God wanted her to be. That moment, though simple in appearance, two young people meeting in a field, was in fact a historic moment, the beginning of a story that would transform Abraham's descendants and establish the lineage that would change all of humanity. After their first encounter in the field, Rebecca and Isaac walked together to the house where their marriage would be formalized. This moment, though simple by the standards of the time, was charged with divine significance. It was not just the union of two people, but the continuation of the promise God had made to Abraham. We can imagine the scene. Abraham's house prepared to welcome his young wife, with every detail carefully arranged. The servants helped, bringing utensils and preparing the space, while Abraham's servant watched with satisfaction, recognizing that his mission was almost complete. Weddings at that time didn't necessarily involve a grand celebration as we know them today, but rather involved rituals of acceptance, blessings, and the official union between the bride and groom. Rebecca, still young, approached Isaac with humility and faith, trusting in God's guidance. Isaac, in turn, welcomed her with joy and gratitude, knowing in his heart that this was the moment God had planned. The Bible shows us that Isaac found comfort in Rebecca. Until then, he had experienced many trials: the death of his mother Sarah, the challenges of life in the desert, and the responsibility of carrying out God's promise. Rebecca's arrival brought comfort, joy, and hope, transforming his heart. We can imagine the knowing looks, the simple gestures of affection, and the mutual respect that was already beginning to form. Rebecca, who had left everything behind, now found security, love, and divine guidance in the man God had chosen to be her husband. This marriage was also a living testament to God's faithfulness. He had guided every step, from the servant's prayer at the well, to Rebecca's hospitality, to the family's blessing, to the couple's union. Nothing outside of God's plan happened by chance. Every detail had a purpose. The union of Rebecca and Isaac marks the beginning of a shared life based on faith, obedience, and trust in God. It is the moment when Abraham's promise begins to be realized in an even more tangible way, and where Rebecca, with courage and humility, enters history as one of the most significant women in the Bible. Marriage was not just a ceremony, it was the beginning of a new era, from a blessed lineage, from a story that would change the trajectory of an entire nation. Rebecca was now part of a plan greater than herself, and every step she took was guided by the hand of God. After their marriage, Rebecca and Isaac began building their life together in Canaan. We can imagine the young woman adjusting to her new home, learning the customs of Isaac's family, and developing a deep bond with her husband. However, there was one challenge that weighed heavily on her. Rebecca couldn't get pregnant. At that time, infertility was considered a great hardship. For a woman, not having children could generate sadness, anxiety, and even feelings of inadequacy. Rebecca, although trusting in God, felt the silent pain of not being able to bear the child the promise required. Each passing year was a reminder of waiting and uncertainty. Isaac, aware of the situation and guided by faith, prayed to God on behalf of Rebecca. He knew that Abraham's promise would only be fulfilled through his descendants, and that Rebecca, chosen by God, played a crucial role in this plan. His prayers were not just requests, but a cry filled with confidence. "Lord, look upon my wife and give us the son you promised through your promise to Abraham." We can imagine Rebecca sitting quietly, reflecting on her life. She may have wondered why she hadn't yet had children, but her faith remained steadfast. Even in the face of pain, she trusted that God was working behind the scenes, preparing the right moment to fulfill his promise. And God answered. After years of waiting, Rebecca finally conceived. but the pregnancy would not be easy or peaceful. The Bible says the children fought inside her womb, and she felt great anguish. Something extraordinary was happening, something beyond her understanding. She then decided to seek guidance from the Lord. Why am I going through this? What does this struggle inside me mean? The Lord revealed to Rebekah that two peoples were in her womb, and that the older would serve the younger. This was a foreshadowing of the future of Esau and Jacob, which would shape not only their own family, but the entire history of the people of Israel. This phase of Rebekah's life is marked by faith, patience, and obedience. She faced the pain of waiting, the uncertainty of the unknown, and yet trusted in the divine plan. Rebekah not only became Isaac's wife, but also a woman prepared by God to bear the children who would continue the promise. The barrenness that seemed to be an obstacle became a moment of spiritual preparation, showing that, even in times of waiting, God fulfills his purposes. According to his wisdom, when Rebekah finally conceived, joy was accompanied by unexpected challenges. The Bible tells us that the twins fought inside her womb, causing her great uneasiness and fear. We can imagine Rebekah sitting, holding her stomach, feeling every strong movement and every kick, trying to understand what that intense struggle meant. She remembered God's promises to Abraham and sensed something extraordinary was happening. With each movement of the babies, she silently asked, "Lord, why do they fight like this? What are you revealing to me?" The Lord answered directly and powerfully, showing Rebekah the meaning of that difficult pregnancy. Two peoples were in her womb, and from the womb, their lives would be intertwined in a relationship of distinction and leadership, because the eldest would serve the youngest. This divine revelation indicated that Esau, the firstborn, and Jacob, the youngest, would have different destinies and play central roles in the history of Israel. We can imagine the mix of fear, curiosity, and faith that Rebekah felt. She knew that God was guiding something much greater than herself, something that would affect future generations. Her pregnancy was more than a physical experience. It was a spiritual moment, a turning point in the history of God's promise. Over the next few months, each kick and movement of the twins reminded Rebekah of the importance of this divine calling. She knew that God was shaping the future within her, and her faith needed to be steadfast. She carried not only the life of two children, but also the responsibility of becoming the mother of the offspring who would fulfill the promise to Abraham. When the first was finally born, Esau, strong and robust, and then Jacob, calmer and more astute, Rebekah saw the fulfillment of what God had revealed. The difference between them from birth already foretold the paths they would follow. Esau, the firstborn, would be leader in some areas, but Jacob, the youngest, would receive the blessing of the promise. Rebekah's pregnancy and the birth of the twins show that even in times of struggle and uncertainty, faith and obedience are rewarded. She trusted God when everything seemed difficult and actively participated in the divine plan, becoming not only a mother but also a protagonist in the story that would shape the people of Israel. Rebekah played a decisive role in fulfilling God's promise. She guided and supported Jacob, the youngest son, to receive the blessing that would guarantee the continuation of Abraham's lineage. Her faith, courage, and discernment demonstrated how God used her choices to fulfill his plans. Through her, the history of Israel and the divine promise were fulfilled, making Rebekah a central woman in biblical history. And if Rebekah's story touched your heart, it made you reflect on faith, courage, and obedience, I invite you to leave your like below. Like this video so more people can learn about this example of faith that spans centuries. And don't forget, share in the comments what you learned from Rebekah, or perhaps a faith experience that transformed your life. Your story can inspire others. Thank you so much for being here with me on this journey. Until the next video, with more Bible stories that teach and transform, may God bless you and your entire family.